Great. Hey, wonderful to be here again. It's really driving over here into the Kennebec River Valley. It's very, it feels so familiar and comforting to come your way, and I just love that drive. I took the back way in. I told I got to cross the river a couple of times, so that was fun. Great. So yeah, I've presented this work. One of the first times I presented the kinds of things I'm going to present today was actually to the Judiciary Committee in the state legislature in 2019, as part of the work that led to the bills that were proposed in the most recent state legislature. So that was a really exciting opportunity. James Francis, myself, Nicole Friedrichs, who's a lawyer, we all presented to the judiciary, and that helped kind of focus in on the need for fixing the tribal sovereignty here. So the goals for today are give some key concepts related to the state of Maine Indian history and policy. Some versions of this talk I go into the doctrine of discovery. I'm not going to do that tonight, and Dwayne Thoma is going to talk about that later in the speaker series, so that's really good. But some other concepts will set up understanding of it, show how issues of racial injustice has shaped state of Maine Indian history and policy, and think about how these inherent tensions play out in the contemporary day, especially with respect to sovereignty and tribal well-being. So this is just a little bit of when we think of sort of major events in a number of these predate the creation of the state of Maine. But when I think about trying to understand what is happening between the tribes and the state, I kind of go to these major events. I'm not going to talk about all of these, and I'm only going to talk about a few of them in detail, but it starts with the Non-Intercourse Act, which is federal law from 1790, which led to the Settlement Act in 1980. And then a series of treaties. These are illegal treaties because of the Non-Intercourse Act. The state constitution, all these acts in the 1820s regulating the life of Indians in the state, and then a series of court cases and some federal laws and studies and issues around voting, and then ultimately up to the Passamaquoddy versus Morton case that leads to the Maine Indian Claims Settlement Act. So there you go. That's the talk. No, I'm done. All right. So just a quick reminder. This is our tribes here across the state. I really should fix this slide. It's now Micmac Nation is what Aroostook Band, formerly Aroostook Band, is calling themselves, and I think that's a great name change. This is actually where our Wabanaki lands are currently in the state, and of course, and I talked about this at length the last time I was here, our diplomacy and the place of our engagement with land, resources, and each other is broadly across the territory of, northern New England and Atlantic Canada. So when we think of Wabanaki space, this is what we're thinking about. It's not bound by the state of Maine. Okay, so the first time you see Indians mentioned in the state of Maine Constitution is in Article 2, Section 1, when it comes to electors. And of course, in 1820, who could vote was really a different set of people than who can vote today. So it said every male citizen of the United States of the age of 21 years and upwards, excepting paupers, persons under guardianship, and Indians not taxed. So those are the categories who can't vote. I mean, it's also non-males, of course, in 1820. And then paupers, persons under guardianship, Indians not taxed. So it's a very particular formulation of Indians not taxed. It's not Indians. They don't identify it as a category which is purely racial. it is a category Indians not tax. So it imagines a really specific category of person, and I'm going to talk a little bit about that. Today, this part of the Constitution reads explicitly, we're still special in the state constitution. Every Indian residing on tribal reservations and otherwise qualified shall be an elector in all county, state, and national elections. And that reflects a constitutional, state constitutional change from the 1950s, and then some legislative changes that are full enfranchisement. I'll talk more about this. As Indians living on reservations in the state of Maine, our full enfranchisement didn't happen until the 1960s. Okay. And then critically, Maine is one of only 5 states to have this category in its state constitution of Indians not taxed. All right. The other major place where we appear in the state constitution is in Article 10, Section 5, Subsection 5, which is part of the Articles of Separation from the state of Massachusetts. And this is in the Constitution, state constitution, that says the state of Maine shall assume and perform all the duties and obligations of Massachusetts towards the Indians, whether the same arise from treaties or otherwise, and for this purpose shall obtain the assent of said Indians, and their release to this Commonwealth of claims, stipulations arising under the treaty at present existing between the Commonwealth and said Indians. So in lawyer speak, that means that can't change anything without the consent of both the Indians and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts if there was a particular agreement with the state of Massachusetts. But the state is assuming all those roles in that. This is a part of the state constitution, I think some of you know this, that has been omitted from the printing of the state constitution since the second half of the 19th century, and I'm going to talk about that because it's when that goes into effect and how it ties into the state's obligations to Indians. Many of us are convinced that they're tied together, that they stopped printing this because they're like, those damn Indians keep bringing up things that Massachusetts promised to them in all these court cases. We should really get rid of that part of the state constitution. So they just made it illegal to print that part of it. So, ooh, I know. Was it? It's like Big Brother in 1984. Okay. Okay, so state of Maine Constitution context. Maine separated from Massachusetts in 1820. Massachusetts demanded that Maine was responsible for these obligations to Indians. And then in January of 1876, the state of Maine began excluding Article 10, Sections 1, 2, and 5 from printed copies of the Maine Constitution, which has Articles of Separation and some other things. And if you want to know more about this exclusion and sort of what led up to, I don't have time tonight to kind of talk about all the ins and outs that led up to it. I was on a panel for the Maine Historical Society. We talked about it, and so there's a web page, I can forward this, where you can see the panel included Corey Hinton and Donna Loring, and has also links to the documents, the primary documents that frame up sort of what we're bringing to that table. So it's all you nerdy history people, please check it out because it's probably the most definitive discussion and support through evidence of what went into this exclusion of this part of the state constitution. Okay. So although redacted and not printed, Section 5 remains in full force. Again, just explaining, it requires Massachusetts consent to alter the Articles of Separation. Maine seems to have gotten around this stipulation by merely removing Section 5 from view. And cutting to the chase, the timing of this redaction indicates that Maine wished to obscure its obligations to compensate, especially there's an 1874 court case that took quite a while to decide. It's called Avery versus Granger, and it had to do with does the state of Maine have obligations to compensate the Passamaquoddy tribe for 15 islands lost in this court decision? And in the treaties with Massachusetts, if there is sort of takings, there's a sort of automatic compensation to the tribes, and then they have to pay damages also to the people that they're taking, there's like double damages. But in fact, what they did in this court case is that they basically made the Passamaquoddy tribe pay for the court costs of the people they were bringing to court to get these lands back. Anyway, just another example of what happens in the history. So this treaty from 1794 would have guaranteed the tribe's possession, or sort of a lot of liabilities associated with it. Yeah.
Darren, can you repeat that sentence again?
Those 15 islands that, and this is part of the reclamation of Pine Island is one of these 15 islands, actually. So that's why it's been such an important and great process to have the Passamaquoddy tribe now be in control of Pine Island once again. And part of the way that they got it was through this court decision as well. Okay. So that's just a little bit of what plays out, why it's obscured from view. It's a particular court case. But that wasn't the only court case in the second half of the 19th century. I'll talk about a few more of those situations. I do want to point out that this notion of Indians not taxed appears in other places. So there's the 4 other states, as well as it appears in the 14th Amendment. And this is important because it once again, even in the 14th Amendment, which gives a lot of other people the right to vote, Indians not taxed is exempted there as well. So representatives, again, apportioned among the several states, respective numbers counting the whole number of persons in each state, excluding Indians not taxed. So once again, and this, I'll talk about it, but this means that there's a law in the 1920s that is required to be passed so Indians become more enfranchised and more citizens of the United States that cleans up this sort of legacy of Indians not taxed. So that's even in the 14th Amendment. So there's something going on here, state law, federal law, this category of Indians not taxed. Okay. So why is this included in our state constitution and the 14th Amendment? And I'm taking these 4 points of what it means from the Department of Interior opinion of the solicitor from 1940, but this is basically the first time in the 1940s under the solicitor of the Department of Interior, Felix Cohen, where they really collect what federal Indian law and sort of what the sort of rights of tribes are for the very first time, and textualize it and kind of pull it all together. And so this is the first time you see kind of a coherent expression of what does this Indians not taxed thing mean. So according to 1940 opinion of the Department of Interior, it reflected first in the prevalent notion that taxation and representation should go hand in hand. So that's a foundational notion in the founding of the American Republic. Taxation, representation. Apparently, some of the founders wrote a bunch of things about that. Okay, so anyway, I love those things that they wrote, by the way. So that tightness of representation and taxation is very important. It also reflects that government taxation is the principal criteria for governmental authority, right? So that's also in the U.S. Constitution, it's in the state constitution as well. And it reflected, very importantly, that the condition of the Indian living was in his separate and independent community, right? If you wanted to just exclude someone based on race, they knew how to do that, right? They talked about that in all sorts of other parts of the Constitution. But they didn't say Indians as a race. They said Indians not taxed. And that was a recognition that Indians, we were separate. We had our own government where we would tax our own selves and have this foundation of government. So unwittingly, and I would remind the Attorney General and the Governor that in the original constitution of the state of Maine, there's this recognition of tribal sovereignty, a separateness from state control. It also meant that they didn't allow us to vote for a very long time in the state of Maine. And as you see, we wanted to maintain some of those elements of our separateness, even when they're like, no, you should come and be full citizens. Yeah, well, we're gonna see like this negotiation that goes back and forth. Yeah. All right. So people understand that Indians not taxed as a formulation is about government representation, voting, inside, outside dynamics of government. Okay. So maybe that would have been good. It might have been, oh, awesome, we're sovereign and we're separate, and sure, we don't vote for their stuff, but they won't vote in our stuff because they're not in our government as Indians. But that quickly turns in the 1820s, and then I'm capturing this from the language from a really famous 1840s case, that otherness, though, of Indians not taxed and the racialization of it, quickly turned from this recognition of sovereignty into a racialized experience. So it basically says, 1842, and there's all sorts of documentation around this and similar quotes from the state saying, in this case, for example, the imbecility on the Indians' part, and the dictates of humanity and ours have necessarily prescribed to them their subjection to our paternal control. And then they're like, in disregard of some rights of man, perhaps, we'll pussyfoot around that a little bit. But that idea that they are imbeciles and therefore don't have full enfranchisement. And if you think about it, the people under guardianship, the paupers, they were picking up on some of that language to not allow us any sense of enfranchisement. But again, they use this term, Indians not taxed, but they didn't play true to the not taxed part, but they did really lean into the Indian and the supremacy of white people over Indians, right? So that's captured in language again and again. So Indians not taxed quickly became racialized and was a defining interpretation by the state of Maine as to how to treat Maine Indians for a really long time. The next major, and I call this sort of 19th and 20th century contradictions. One of the things that is really clear is that the state of Maine wants it both ways in terms of actually the case where they said, you're imbeciles, it was a contracts case. And it was a non-native person suing a native, a Penobscot, for violating a contract. And they're like, and the defense was, well, we can't even vote. You won't let us do all these things. I'm just like I'm like a juvenile. I'm under ward. I shouldn't be held responsible for this contract. They're like, no, absolutely, you should be held liable for the contract, but you're still an imbecile. So there are these contradictions where it's like, oh, if you wouldn't let a child sign a contract, even though you're saying we have paternal control over them. You see, it's both ways. It's very clearly, and you see this with the taking of the 4 townships from Penobscot Nation up in the Katahdin region. This is repeated again and again and again, where we're kind of not enfranchised, not having even the basic rights of man, but then being held responsible under these other mechanisms. Okay. Do you want to be an Indian now? It's really fun. So, okay. So in 1892, another really major case, and this is where the similar contradictions come into play. State versus Newell, it's a Passamaquoddy hunting case. And it's a Maine Supreme Court case. They basically, again, Passamaquoddies, they're like, here's the treaty. I know you won't let us print this part of the Constitution that says, but here are our treaties. It talks about us hunting in all these locations, blah, 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 blah. And they're like, you're not even, they keep calling them the Passamaquoddy tribe, but they're like, you can no longer make war and peace. This is not a standard of law that appeared anywhere before or after. Therefore, you're not a tribe. Even though they keep referring to them as the Passamaquoddy tribe, they're like, the people who signed this treaty and you are not the same. you don't have the same connection. They just make this out of whole cloth, just saying, we're not going to let you hunt in the traditional territory that was promised to you in treaties simply because we made up this rule, which actually I bet you the Passamaquoddy tribe could, I mean, I don't know if they're not going to win a war necessarily, but they could say, we declare war, and, you know, I've heard people talk about shutting down the causeway across, you know, to Eastport. I mean, that wouldn't be that hard to do. So, I mean, I think this idea of could they make war and peace, that's just a made up thing. You know, that's just to make it so they don't have hunting rights. Okay. And then this case and others like it, Maine courts ignored all sort of federal Indian law standards where treaties and hunting rights were being affirmed again and again in federal Indian law, and maintained and really leaned into maintaining Indians as second-class citizens, wards of the state, with no rights to manage our own resources or vote, and interpreting Indians not taxed purely in racial terms to maintain this sort of control. Again, in an ironic contradiction, it was this approach, ignoring federal law and imposing racial secondary status, that led to the Passamaquoddy v. Morton case, which started in '72, finally decided in '75, and that put into doubt almost 2/3 of the state of Maine in terms of these treaties that were signed between the state of Massachusetts and the tribes here and the state of Maine that were in violation of federal law. So just by ignoring federal law, this eventually caught up to the state of Maine, and these sort of in this attempt to kind of really racialize and deny rights did eventually, in some way, catch up to the state. All right, so this is my human interest story, and it's about one of our famous Penobscot people, Lucy Nicolar, also known as Princess Wadawaso or Aunt Lou. That was what she was referred to in the community. And she had her own really interesting experience as being an artist and a performer, and like people like Molly Spotted Elk, right, was one of these sort of made a living as a traveler, storyteller, and also as a powerful advocate for our people. So in 1900, when she was pretty young, still in her late teenage years, she visited the Women's Debating Society in New York City. And this is all found in, documented by a reporter that was there, told this story. And at the end of a lively discussion about immigration, as you could imagine such debates today, the debaters resolved that it was dangerous and threatening to all true Americans, right? All these people coming here, sucking up our resources. These debates are not new, right? According to a journalist who wrote about the event, Lucy took their conclusion as her cue. She arose to speak, her stately form, as noted by the reporter, commanding instant recognition, and she says, "I believe I'm the only true American here. I think you have decided rightly. Of all my forefathers' country, from the St. John River to the Connecticut, we have but a little island 1/2 mile square. There are only about 500 of us now. We are very happy on our island, but we are poor. The railroad corporations, which did their share of robbing us of our land, are now begrudging us half-rate fare, but we forgive you all." Wonderful. Diplomacy. We talked about diplomacy last time. This is her. There was a long silence and the subject was laid on the table. The president of the society said that, the musical feature would have to be omitted as the pianist was sick, and asked, would someone please volunteer? We know what's going to happen. According to the reporter, no one had the courage to try an impromptu before the large audience. At last, who should beg to be allowed to try but Wadawaso, who played some selections from Chopin with the greatest of ease, and sang a plaintive air which touched the hearts of all those present and made them feel like doing anything in the world. Thank you, Aunt Lou. All right. So that was just my human interest story. I just thought that we're going to see her again. This is also a setup in my attempt to be a good storyteller. Okay, so great intervention, right? Great to call out the contradictions, great to, this is the diplomacies I talked about last time, and really shape how we engage in our rights today. In 1924, Congress passes the Indian Citizenship Act. But it was originally proposed in 1917, 1918. So there was definitely word that this was eventually going to become law. So Native people would become U.S. citizens, and that would perhaps help with enfranchisement. It didn't help in Maine. But many Native people were sort of advocating to not accept this citizenship, refusing to give up tribal sovereignty and sort of our sense of our own control in our own nations. In 1920, hearing about this proposed law, the Passamaquoddy tribe petitioned then Governor Carl Milliken to support the tribe's exemption from U.S. citizenship. And this is the letter the Passamaquoddies wrote to Governor Milliken. We, the undersigned members of the Passamaquoddy tribe of Indians, humbly beg the state of Maine to use her influence against making Indians citizens of the United States for the following reasons. We are satisfied with our lot as Indians. The Passamaquoddy tribe is always loyal to America. In the Revolutionary War, the Passamaquoddy tribe gave her whole strength for the cause. We fought under Colonel Allen. There's some famous letters from Colonel Allen to George Washington. You should check those out. We link to them in the Maine Historical Society piece. And then Colonel Allen said in part to the Massachusetts Congress, "These Indians who have been in the service of the United States shall be taken care of in a fatherly way by the United States, and they shall enjoy every right and privilege. In the Civil War, we raised a company of 14 men. The World War I, we raised a company of 24 men out of a male population of only 100. And if people know this history, Native Americans are some of the highest percentage groups to go to war on behalf of the United States. If the law be already passed, let us be exempt from it." So, what are they saying? It's very subtle, right? That we can be with you, but we can be separate, right? This is a non-threatening diplomatic framing, right? We'll fight with you. We've always fought with you, but we are our own thing, right? It's to put at ease, like, oh, you want to be separate? What are you going to do about that? And they're like, oh no, we'll fight with you. If you listen to patriots talk, right? That's the ultimate sacrifice. We'll do that, but we are our own separate thing, and we don't want to be in your game of citizenship. Okay. In 1941, to settle the voting issue, because the state constitution was still Indians not taxed, that was in there, and that had been interpreted to basically any Indian who lived on an Indian reservation, actually. So some Indians who lived off of reservation were able to vote. In 1941, a bill titled "An Act Permitting Indians to Vote in State Elections" was presented before the legislature, and it proposed a poll tax for Indians. They were really taking their cues from the South and racialization. And then that was viewed by the courts then as inherently illegal and insufficient. I mean, that is illegal. I mean, it wasn't illegal because this is before the Voting Rights Act, but it should be considered illegal to have a poll tax on certain groups of people. But it was withdrawn. After World War II, Native American veterans and others made delegations to the U.S. House of Representatives and to the United Nations, calling attention to their condition, quote unquote. There's a whole series of episodes of Penobscot delegates to the UN, Passamaquoddy delegates to both in the U.S. and Canada, really making an active stride for and set the stage for what we consider kind of the contemporary scene of tribal rights discussions. This led to a change in the state constitution in the 1950s, I believe that was passed in 1953. And then finally, in 1954, Indians were allowed to vote in federal elections in the state of Maine. And there's Lucy, Princess Wadawasso. She's voting. All right, so 1900, she's like, yeah, immigrants, bad idea. We forgive you all. And then now she's voting, the first person as an honored member. And this voting box is the same box I vote in when I vote in Penobscot elections to today. So this ballot box is very meaningful, and because it marks a shift in our rights and the way we are engaging the broader public. Okay. Full enfranchisement doesn't happen, despite the state constitutional change, until 1967, when Maine reservation Indians could vote in not just state elections. So in 53, 54, we could vote for governor, but we weren't fully enfranchised because we were not included in any of the House or Senate districts, right? So the reservations were exempted from that. I guess you could say because we had these non-voting representatives to the state legislature that they thought, but they're not voting, so it's not really enfranchisement. So this finally changes in the 1960s. I mean, this is like, my dad was born in 1931. He didn't know anyone who had voted when he was growing up, or could vote, right? I mean, that's not that far away. So that context really defines an experience. In 1942, so this is, I'm not a historian, I'm an anthropologist, so I don't have to follow the thing. In 1942, the state of Maine engages in a sort of self-study. The Maine legislature commissions a report on the Maine Indians. And it's like, what's going on with the Indians? And part of it had to do with, at the beginning of World War II, there's intense poverty. There's sort of headlines in newspapers talking about just how Indians in their own communities are starving. There's a lack of resources and support, despite the state of Maine having regulated almost every part of Indian life and having a fund that was supposed to be distributed to Indians on a regular basis. It's our resources and money. And then if we were asked the Indian agent for something, we were considered beggars, right? We were considered the worst people, even though we were just asking this person for our money, right? They held in trust for us. All right, so this Proctor report identifies this very dark period of this kind of enforced impoverization on Indian reservations in the state. Again, tribal members grew up believing they were paupers. Little or no, there's this lack of dignity, self-respect. The report uses a bunch of racist language to kind of describe this as well, so it's also hard to kind of read from a contemporary perspective. But again, not aware that the goods and services were actually what the tribe was owed. And the state of Maine during World War II, and they readily admit it in the Proctor report, impounded the trust fund monies to pay for state expenses incurred during the war. They had slipped in like an IOU there. They're like, we owe you. And then they never paid it back. But, I guess this will lead anyone to hate the government, I suppose, if they took your money and wrote you an IOU and never, Okay, so again, this sort of legacies of racism. Indian is apt to work until he gets his first pay and then quits until his money is gone. Unwilling to exert themselves mentally, shiftless, all these sorts of kind of language that requires, of course, a deep understanding of how poverty functions in not only in Native communities, but in any place in rural Maine, right, would be mobilizing this kind of language. Okay. Between 1942 and 1974, the state starts to loosen its grip upon the day-to-day life of Indian people. So things get somewhat better. Some of the Indian agents, starting in the late 60s, are Native people themselves. So they're often far more generous with state funds and trying to equitably distribute these funds within the communities. But there's constantly cuts and all the things that you would imagine that if you're considering the state as, which they never replace the trust fund money. So it's like each year, sort of our resources for our goods and services are kind of at the political ploy of whoever's in Augusta. So in 1974, the Civil Rights Commission in the state of Maine, it's technically the Maine Advisory Committee to the U.S. Commission on Civil Rights, wrote this report and redid the Proctor report. It was basically like, what's the status of Indians? Let's try to really get at it in the context of a civil rights journey and understand what's really happening. This is more scientific than its Proctor report cousin, as you can imagine. And there's more sort of actual data to kind of look at. Here they tracked, and there's a bunch of things. I'm just going to talk about unemployment rates. I apologize. But this is just to describe the situation. In 1973, the unemployment rate among Maine Indians was so high that it actually had its own class, or sort of, they didn't even kind of count it actually in the state's numbers often, because they're like, oh, it's Indian, so we probably shouldn't even count that. So a lot of years, it wasn't even in the 60s and 70s, even went in as a part of the state's unemployment rate. Among reservation Indians, it was estimated that unemployment was between 60 and 80%, and it was about 60% at Penobscot Reservation, 70% to Passamaquoddy reservations, off-reservation Indians approximately 50%, and then sort of among all Maine Indians in 73, they eventually come to the 65% number. They go in, they describe the reasons for this. There's a number of reasons for it. Some of it is Indians maintaining seasonal round, trying to hunt, trying to live off cultural resources. There is also intense racism against hiring Indians in a number of trades, and denial of union participation. I mean, all the things that you would expect. And it goes into a number of these situations. And I can talk about that more later, but to me, the unemployment was just an easy thing to kind of understand in this context. Because then in 2012, and these are numbers that are post the Settlement Act, post federal recognition, but also in the context, in the post 1980 Settlement Act context, where we are not in full control over our own economies as Maine Indians. We don't have the kind of recognized sovereignty that other tribes have. And here you can see unemployment rates. Let's see here. So if you look, this is from Passamaquoddy. So 28% unemployment rate. Across all the Wabanaki tribes, 21%. The unemployment rate just in Washington County at the time was 10%, and then in Maine at the time was 8%. So, that's way better than 60, 70%, but there is a huge sets of disparities still. And so, and also you see some of the education levels, and I think education then, now, I think for a lot of Native people, and you're meeting a bunch of pretty well-educated Wabanaki people in your speaker series, like the education numbers are not that much, not that disparate when it comes to the tribes and state of Maine people. All right. This is from the Truth and Reconciliation Commission report on Maine Indian child welfare. And here you see also, and I tried to compare those 1970s numbers pre-Settlement Act, pre-federal recognition, to sort of more contemporary the numbers. So in Indian children in Maine in 1972 were placed in foster care at a rate 25 times higher than non-Indian children. In 73, it was 20 times higher, 75, 19 times higher. For Aroostook County alone in 1972, the rate of removal for Indian children was 62 times higher than the statewide rate for non-Indian children. The rates for Maine were the second highest in the nation at the time in terms of Indian child removal. So there's something also going on there, removing children from Indian families, legacies of these removals from, all the kinds of, we've seen in the press, the boarding schools and residential schools, but this serves that purpose as well. Now, after the Settlement Act and after federal recognition, the state of Maine and the tribes started participating in the Indian Child Welfare Act, which gives some consideration to tribes in terms of adoption, not as much in terms of removal. But things do improve. From 2000 to 2013, Wabanaki children in Maine entered foster care an average of 5 times the rate of non-Native children. So an improvement, no doubt. Still a horrific disparity around these removals. And that was why there was a Truth and Reconciliation Commission. I strongly urge you, if you have not read their report in terms of how to fix this system of inequity, a lot of it relies on tribal sovereignty and our control over our own families and communities. So I will quickly cut to the conclusion and say, in both child welfare and employment statistics, right, clearly demonstrate paternalism, racism, state control, bad, 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 right, for our tribal nations. Federal recognition, Settlement Act have made things better. There are still these disparities. And according to any number of pieces of scholarship and the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, these disparities can and should be addressed by recognizing and enhancing Wabanaki tribal sovereignty. That's my talk for today. Thank you. All right, what do we got?
I do have a question, if you just have a minute.
Yeah, of course.
Can you explain, okay, if all you want your own land, like everybody does. Do you want to be completely separate from Maine? What would be your ideal? Completely separate, like countries, separate within the state of Maine or within the United States, wherever, Canada, wherever. What would be the best, the ideal for you?
Yeah, I think each of the tribal nations would be a little bit different. So I don't think there's a standard. I think the standard that was sought after in LD 1626, which did not make it into law, was on par with just all the other federally recognized tribes, which involves a lot of civil regulatory authority. Basically, the majority of civil regulatory authority over our own lands and peoples, and very little, some criminal authority, often in concert with other governments, be that state or federal governments. There's some differences across Indian country. So I think that was the baseline. If I were to describe it, like what were we shooting for?
So what would you say you would want? Would that work for you in terms of?
Yeah, and I think.
Darren, can you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry. Yes. So what is this sovereignty that you're speaking of there, Dr. Ranco? What does that look like? And is it a separate country, like separate nation state? It is, and I've had debates with other Native scholars about this, and so I'm not an innocent. I'm not objective, but I think when we talk about tribal sovereignty, the terms together actually matter. When people think about sovereignty, they think of legal and juridical and political control, right, in a very specific way. I think at its core, tribal sovereignty, I mean, it's in treaties, it's already recognized as different. And I think in our cultural frameworks, our notions of legal, juridical, and political authority are also different. The source of our civic culture has other cultural frameworks to it. And I think one of the real challenges for us as tribes is to make that our tradition of our own particular tradition of civic culture, I'm just using that generic Western term to talk about how we formulate a set of community-based relations to get along with one another, and what principles do we use to do that, right? Come from some other places than purely the British and American common law. So I do think the tribal sovereignty also keeps us honest and sort of in perspective around those differences. I mean, some of that is recognized. For example, there are a whole host of things broadly in federal Indian law, like basically tribes are not subject to the establishment clause around religion in the Constitution. Kind of, it's a little bit of a gray area, but there's sort of these court cases that say tribes as political and civil, jurisdictional, and these other ways as nations can choose a different formulation around how religion plays in their civic culture, for example. So that's even extra constitutional. That's saying, oh, it's even different than any state. No state could do that, right? So even in the legal, sometimes people are like, well, tribes will be like states. That's an okay shorthand, but it's not the only shorthand, because sometimes they are very purposely in partnership with states. And if you listen to the debates, the tribal side of this was, our sovereignty was to become a better set of partners with the state. It was not to be like, state, go away. It was, state, please stop standing on our neck and preventing us from breathing fully our sovereignty so we can be full and equal partners as we care for our people, our land, and this whole place called Maine. So I think it's I know I'm not answering it, and that's like what academics don't do, is we don't ever clearly answer anything. But I do think it will look, I'll be like, oh, it's like a state. It's not really, it's tribal sovereignty, and I think understanding it, and that's been one of the challenges, right, is that, and I'm on the Maine Indian Tribal State Commission right now, right, and I'm like, I sometimes feel like some of the state representatives to that think that it's a zero-sum game, meaning it's like, if Indians get more control and authority over ourselves, that is against the state, and then the state gets less, and then that it is simply a zero-sum game of like, if we have 60, they have 40, or if they have, and none of the tribal people think about it that way. We think about it just as, we gain, you gain. We gain, you gain. And I think if we can all agree to we all gain together, things would look differently. But I think politics, such as it is, I know I ranted about politics last time, it feels like there's a sense that with the state, and I mentioned this last time, maybe they just feel like, not everyone in the state, there's 1,600 people that went to the legislature and advocated for 1626. So there's a lot of people across the state that supported this notion that when Wabanaki people have more control and sovereignty, that's actually good for all of us in Maine.
Well, I think that's what we needed, and I think that's how you would explain that to other people, that it's not a zero-sum game, and it's really tough to get through to people.
Yeah.
That's the issue.
Yeah, I mean, our politics is so defined by that. Yeah, I agree. So I'm glad I just didn't answer your question. No, I mean, I think you get where I'm saying. I mean, I think that the baseline that we were asking for was this largely about our civil jurisdictional control over our lands, people, territories, that sort of thing. Yeah. Up back.
To do with sort of the differences between treaties signed pre-revolution, but not pre-constitution. So some
Yeah,
pre-1776
yeah. And
And-
pre non-intercourse acts.
and pre-1790, non-intercourse act, and treaties signed between the United States and tribes, by and large, west of the Mississippi. Yeah, it's an interesting question, and this is why I talk about the doctrine of discovery. This is why leaving it out is tricky, because to understand the Non-Intercourse Act doesn't come out of just nowhere. It actually is an affirmation that only first European Christian nations and then the settler representation of them, and then the settler nation states that grow up out of those settler right, extensions, that the authority in terms of contact and negotiating treaties always adhere to the ultimate sovereign from the European tradition. So it really isn't different, and if you read Passamaquoddy v. Morton, they contemplate that very question. They're like, well, first of all, in that court case, which is the Passamaquoddy tribe suing the Department of Interior to represent them against the state of Maine for illegal takings of land. And ultimately, the only thing that was decided was, does the federal government have a trust responsibility, this unique responsibility that because of treaties and other agreements, do they have that to the Maine tribes? And they said, there's nothing in federal Indian law. Actually, what they said was, every indication in the Marshall Trilogy from the 1830s and after is that this relationship and this recognition of the federal government's role in relation to tribes does not require a treaty with the United States. It only requires subsequent obligations, which are very clear. I just showed you what they were, even though the state of Maine tried to hide them. And then this idea that a state could sign a treaty, which, just think about that. We wouldn't have allowed it, and then it wouldn't be like, hey, the state of New Hampshire now is signing actually the state of Vermont tried to do this, right? Sometime in the 1790s, and they were kind of forced to come back into the United States because they were starting to sign their own treaties. So there's all these indications that states don't have this ability to negotiate with tribes, as it says in the Non-Intercourse Act. So it's very clearly against the rationale that there's this huge separation between Eastern and Western treaties. Part of it comes from the fact of where that Non-Intercourse Act comes from, the doctrine of discovery. I mean, this is like me trying to endorse the doctrine of discovery. That's absurd, of course, right? That meant that was the very definition of supremacy, religious supremacy, and then becomes racial supremacy. But that notion of the sovereign having control. I mean, what's interesting about it, of course, is that in Maine and some other places is that, we have all these sort of minor revolutions on the Maine frontier of individual citizens saying, screw you and all your proprietors who have the deeds from the sovereign, and we're just going to control that, there's a whole bunch of that happens here a little bit here, but, mid-coast, there's a lot of this sort of reaction to that sovereign control. But that ultimately is still, it is federal, right?
A requisite for the state to follow the Non-Intercourse Act?
Yeah, no, so many of those treaties, the ones after 1790 are in violation of them.
Right.
But those aren't the only treaties that Massachusetts and the Commonwealth of Massachusetts takes over for the colony of Massachusetts as well, right? So that's why some lawyers there's some differences during the period of the Articles of Confederation versus the Constitution. There's actually some differences. There isn't an operational non-intercourse act of federal authority. It's pretty clear though in the Marshall Trilogy that, and this is why I'm saying that it doesn't even need to be a federal law. Like there was a presumption because of the doctrine of discovery of federal authority in negotiation with tribes, because it was always the sovereign and those who represented the sovereign that had the power to negotiate with Indians. And every controversy, you know, that didn't include the sovereign, you know, if you signed a deed with Indians, I mean, I kind of covered this last time, and it wasn't sanctioned by the sovereign, no, you might as well sign a blank piece of paper, right? So that discourse is so foundational. If the state, if in Passamaquoddy v. Morton they had tried to undo that, that would have undone the whole system of doctrine of discovery, and it might have actually undermined the entirety of American property law if they had actually done that. Do you see what I'm saying? Like, because you can't. Where do you go back to the original deed? How did the original person get the deed? And who is it sanctioned by? Do you see what I'm saying? Like, it would undermine the entirety of property in the whole of the United States. I mean, that would have been an interesting thing.
Yeah.
Maybe that's. We missed an opportunity. I don't know.
Thank you.
Yeah. This is like law school. I love it. Okay. Yeah.
So I've been in some communication over the past couple of years with Donna Loring, and so she just recently shared with me a copy of that work that she did with some other attorneys on One Nation Under Fraud.
Yep.
And I found that was a difficult read. It was a little, and for someone who's not a lawyer, although what was part of what was interesting to me was the variations of it, interpretation of these relationships over time by different juries, different judges, and it actually reminded me of where we are as a nation in terms of both the Second Amendment and Roe v. Wade in terms of things have been changed that way. But I'd just be interested in your general impression of that piece of work.
Yeah, so this is about a document recently released called Remonstrance,
I think, is
One Nation Under Fraud. So it goes into this document. It's a very interesting document, and it has a lot of interesting primary sources in it. I mean, I alluded to a number of these situations in a more general sense, but it really dives into the 1940s piece of taking the trust from Indians and using it to pay off war expenses by the state of Maine. Yeah, I mean, I think always, right, there are changing interpretations of laws and intentions, and, you know, I'm not an originalist, nor would I ever say, like, that precedent means nothing. You know, I went to law school for a little while. I have a master's in environmental law. But I will say that I think always changing interpretations as we know more, as we evolve in some ways. I think that's always a part of this. And you could say, you know, it's always this back and forth, right, in terms of what was the intent. I really aim to tell truthful stories of the histories so we can use the best of what we know today to address it. You know, I don't, and it's not to blame anyone. It is, as you see me now twice, I lay out, as a scholar, a very specific set of facts that I say, these are the problems, and this is our pathway to fix it, right? Never do it to make anyone feel bad or anything like that. I assume that you collectively want to work with me. And this is what I've been taught as a Native person. And perhaps this teaching fails us at times because that is not always the case, that a group of people we are in conference with will want to solve a mutually agreed upon problem. But I enter it always that way, and I think my, absurd amount of training as a scholar, right, helps me come to the articulation of these facts. So I think that's always the discussion that I would want to have. I think, I don't know, 80% of the people I run into, that's the discussion they want to have. So I think, at the end of the day, this seeming back and forth of interpretation is for us to wrestle with in the present, and to do the best with what we can about that. So I'm pretty sure Donna agrees with that as well. But I would say, I've been in a conversation with her. If you've been listening to her podcast, you've heard my voice. I don't know how many episodes we're in, a dozen at least, with Harold Prince, just trying to kind of unearth the truth of this history to understand why we've come to this particular set of problems and be like, now what? So I mean, it's a great question though, and I appreciate it. Yeah.
How would we find access to that podcast between you and Donna and
You can go to WERU. It's called Wabanaki Windows, and that's Donna's radio program. And it's a pretty clear catalog of these discussions. And she had some early. I was not involved in the first few episodes of it, but since she started way back before the Revolutionary War, and it was really a series on. It's supposed to be about sovereignty, but it's just sort of unmasked sort of these iterations of it through time. And we're now finally up to the Settlement Act era and trying to understand that. So. And you'll have Maria Gerard come in a couple of weeks to talk about the Settlement Act, and in my opinion, there's no one better at articulating the moments of negotiation and misunderstandings perhaps during the Settlement Act period. She's just really does that in a very special and super scholar. I mean, she went to all the archives, she talked to all the people, she pulled all of it together to kind of come up with a coherent story. And it's sloppy, just like history. And just like my answer to Anything else? Let me see.
No
any-
questions.
no chats?
No.
Just things of like,
Comments.
how do I? Cool.
That was great.
Thanks,
Thank you.
everyone.
Thank you.
Great to see you.